Hey guys, welcome back to Gotta Be Geek, where we go through tutorials, dev tools, and host tech talks to help you be a better engineer or developer. Let's talk about React. And you might be wondering yourself, what is this React that you speak of? Well, if you're asking yourself that, that's great, because that's exactly what we're going to cover in today's video while we make an application using the React framework. Coming up. Let's go over some prerequisites for this video before you get any further so that you can make sure it's easy for you to follow along. So I'm making some assumptions that you have a basic understanding of some concepts and the languages HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. If you don't worry, I'll include some links in the description below that you can use to go get some information and some basic knowledge on that stuff, and then come back to this video when you're ready. Now that we got the prerequisites out of the way, let's talk about what exactly React is. So what is React exactly? Well, React is a JavaScript library used to build user interfaces, and there are other frameworks or libraries out there that are pretty popular as well. Two of them are Vue and Angular. In the future, I'll do a comparison video between React, Vue, and Angular, and additionally, I'll do some deep dive videos where I go over Angular and Vue as well, so keep an eye out for those videos in the future. One of the things that React is most known for is their use of what's referred to as the virtual DOM, or document object model. The DOM is a tree data structure, which means generally speaking, updates to the DOM can be really fast. But what happens is once that element is updated along with its children, that element and the children need to be re-rendered and repainted for the UI to see the changes. This is what can make it pretty slow, especially in a larger application with the more changes that you need to make. This is where the concept of the virtual DOM comes in. So the virtual DOM makes changes in its virtual version of the DOM instead of the real DOM. And you may be asking yourself, well, if we're just making all the changes in the virtual DOM, what are we gaining in performance instead of making those changes in the real DOM? Well, the way that it handles this is when a change is made, the virtual DOM makes a comparison to the previous version of the DOM and only finds the exact changes to the important nodes or the relevant nodes that it needs to make in the real DOM, meaning that while many changes may be happening in the virtual DOM, only a very limited set of changes are actually made to the real DOM, which is what makes React stand out in performance when it comes to UI applications. So how does React use the virtual DOM? Well, in the React UI, every piece is a component, and each component has its own state. And React uses what's called an observable pattern to manage and track the state changes of each component. And so when a change is made in a component, it actually uses the virtual DOM diff comparing that we spoke about earlier to determine what changes need to be made in the real DOM. Now that you have a basic understanding of what React is, what the virtual DOM is, how it works, and the general concept behind React and its use of components, and comparing those changes on the virtual DOM to track state, let's hop over on the computer and we'll make our to-do list application so you can see these things in action. Okay, so I've pulled up the React tutorial code base that I have a link for in the description for you to pull and use as a template to start off on. And we're going to use this template for our to-do list application. And so like many of the videos I've done before, if you haven't watched them, I'm usually going to create a file and then go through and explain kind of what I've added. So the first thing we'll do here is add all the new package dependencies that we're going to need through this base project that was based on the original Webpack tutorial project that I had done, and then I'll go over the different packages once I add them in. Okay, so now that we've got all these packages here, we'll go ahead and go through and explain what they're for. So some of them that are pretty easy is the types. So some of the different dependencies that we have, we're just pulling in the types for those so that we have those. So not much to explain there. You can see that for dev dependencies, again, so just to kind of confirm understanding here is that dev dependencies are things that we only need for build time stuff. And as far as what actually gets bundled into the browser code is everything down here in the main dependencies. So We have our types, and then I've removed style loader in favor of mini CSS extract plugin, just because I wanted to include some CSS in the index HTML file to have some styles kind of applied right away rather than waiting for React to load into the browser. And so what would happen is there would be a short delay where the styling that I put for the main HTML page wouldn't show up until React had kind of loaded in for a split second, and I just didn't want that to be the case. And so this is just an alternate approach to kind of loading CSS in. And then everything else stays the same there. And then for our dependencies, we removed Lodash because that was the example package that I had added in for the Webpack tutorial project. And we're not using that here. And so I've added in some stuff. So hot loader React, this is just there's a lot to probably explain or kind of go through with this, but this just ensures that your hot module replacement stuff works for your React, so that when you're working in a development scenario, that everything, when you make a change and it runs, it'll automatically change and update the browser page for you, so you don't have to like refresh or restart and then rebuild and stuff like that. So, and GUID TypeScript is just a package to get a GUID. A GUID is a globally unique identification. And so this just makes it so I can generate a random kind of unique string for what we'll be doing. And then all the React dependencies. So React, the React DOM, which we had spoken about, the primary React hot loader, and then the router, because we're going to add some routing into this just so we can see what it's like to have a page that's, not just a single page application that's got multiple routes to it. So you have like an about page or a contact us page or whatever it was going to be that you wanted to have multiple kind of pages within your single page application. And so we're going to add a simple about page to our to-do list application as a way to just kind of see what that looks like, so that when you build your own application, regardless what it is, you kind of have some familiarity, if I can say that, with how to use the router. So we'll go through and install all of our dependencies. Okay, so now we'll go through and start adding our main stuff here. First thing we'll do is we'll modify our Webpack config file to do what we need for running React. I'll go ahead and make the changes necessary for this, and then we'll cover them. Okay, so we've got all the changes here. So first one was the addition of the mini CSS extract plugin, because we're going to be removing the style loader. So we pulled that import in. I removed the mode for development so that wasn't stuck on a new development, and I'll show you why on the package.json here in a minute. We've told the regex matcher for the rules for deciding which files TS loader would process, to tell it to include not only TS files, but anything that has X as well at the end of it. And then we've changed out style loader here for the mini CSS extract plugin loader. We've told Webpack to scan for TSX files as well as TS and JavaScript. We've added this alias in here, which isn't required because you actually don't need to use the hot loader React stuff, which I'll kind of show some examples of using it or not using it. But this just ensures that when Webpack processes or uses the React DOM package, that it instead uses this patched version to ensure that our hot module replacement works correctly. And then in our entry file here, we have the index TS file changed over to TSX. Then the mini CSS extract plugin configuration. There's tons of ways that this can be configured. This is a pretty standard approach that you'll find in their documentation, so I'm not going to go too much into that, but this should suffice for most situations. And then the HTML Webpack plugin, we've changed this where before it said like title development, and then now we've said template, and we're basically telling it a HTML file that we're going to supply to it for it to use as an example for instead of just creating one, it's we're going to pre-fill it with stuff that we want in it, and then it will populate the right JavaScript and CSS files when it's done. And I think that covers that. So going back to the package.json file, we previously were running this start command in the Webpack dev server with development from the config file. But what that meant is with the config file, we were overriding the fact that the default for Webpack is to run in production mode. So it changes some things like whether or not minification happens and things like source maps. So we'll make that kind of on demand here to do things like minification, and I'll show what minification versus non-minification looks like. And then we're going to add the hot flag here, which again is optional. So you can remove the hot flag here if you're not going to do that. You can also ignore pulling in this hot loader React DOM package, and you can also ignore using this alias if you're not going to use the hot module replacement, as they are not required, but just makes development a little bit better. And what that does, if you're curious, is just ensures that you don't have to refresh the page for your changes to take effect. When you save your files, it will automatically rerun the build as it normally does, and then it will change everything out and hot reload them internally for you. So then the next thing we're going to do is add in that HTML file that we're going to add, and I'll fill this out and then we'll explain it a little bit. Okay, so this is our very basic HTML file. We're setting the language localization for the HTML to English, and the char set to UTF-8. There's a lot of these. I'm not going to get too much into detail. And then we're just setting some configuration here for the viewport. Also different things here that I could probably spend a significant amount of time talking about, so I'm not going to go into those. And then the main part here is this div with an ID, and IDs are unique, so there only can be one with React app. And then this is optional. You don't have to do loading here. You can leave it empty. I just kind of like to have it as a personal preference. Depending on how fast everything loads up, you may not even notice it, but if anything, you probably see it for about a half a second as the React application is loaded into this element. And then that's it for the HTML file. So we'll change our index to a React file. You can see the icon is changed here. We can remove all this other junk, and then I'll add in what we need and review it. Okay, so you'll notice a couple of these things are red. It's just because they're not there, so don't worry. We're going to fill those out. We're importing the React, and you're going to have to do this for pretty much every React file that you have. We're importing the DOM so that we can tell our virtual DOM that we talked about earlier to render the app component, and we're telling it where we want it, and that's going to be within the React app element that we talked about in the HTML file. This piece here is optional. This is just with the hot module reloading kind of aspect. Basically because in TypeScript, the node module doesn't have the hot property on it. Development time or at build time, but it will at runtime. We're saying if a truthy value here, that if hot is there, then we're going to call this except method on it. If it's not there, if it's undefined, or then we're just going to not do anything. So you can either add this or not. It just needs there to be there for the hot module reloading aspect. And we'll move on to creating the app file. So before I get into creating the component file here for the app, the naming convention that I have here is just the way that I like to name things. I've done a project structure video before that I'll have a link for that in the top that you can click on if you want. kind of goes over some file naming and project structure kind of aspects. Actually, I don't know if it has file naming per se. It might have a little bit in there, but you can watch that. There's different ways. It's just a kind of personal preference and structuring and naming schema that I try to follow. May not be the same every single time. So if you want to name your files something different, just kind of try and follow a pattern, but you don't necessarily have to kind of follow the pattern and way that I'm structuring things. So we'll go ahead and add in our app component stuff. Okay, so you may have noticed while I was typing this, I was getting a little irritated with some red that was showing up that didn't need to be there. And that was because what I'd forgotten to go over was change. You probably saw me, it was going really fast, but you probably might have noticed I switched over this tsconfig.json file for a moment. The reason for that was because for React, you need to include this JSX React tag here, so the TypeScript knows basically how to work with it, and then this module resolution flag here. I honestly can't remember if this one's required or not, but it's in most of the projects I've done in the past, so forgive me if I'm forgetting for the moment. So I added it just in case, but that may not be required. And then there's a few things that are still red here, again, just things that we haven't created yet that we'll get to, so don't worry. So what I've done here is created the basic kind of application, and we're creating a main element here, and inside it is our router. And there's different routers you can do. The hash router, and I'll have a link for probably React and React router stuff, because there's a lot to go over that I don't want to try and get too deep into, because I could probably make this video really long if I do that. But I like the hash router because it's a quick and cheap way to be able to have non-static routes. I don't know of a good short way to explain that, but basically if you did the normal router, which it would make it so that if I go to my browser page, the main kind of home page, that just root directory here, I would be able to then go to the About page and click on it. But if I just tried to navigate directly to the About page without first visiting the root page, then it wouldn't work. There is several different ways to kind of manage that if you're trying to allow people to directly link to a particular page without having to first visit your main page. This is just the quickest way. Some people don't like it because it adds the hash bang, this little guy, into your URL, and then everything else kind of comes after it. So some people don't like it, and it may cause issues with some things. I may possibly do a video in the future to go over all the different ways you could probably do the React router to kind of showcase how to solve that issue if you do want those kind of direct links to work. But just to make things quick and easy, this is the one I'd chosen for this one. And so then here I've just created a nav element that's got a list, and I've done a little bit of styling on it. I didn't want to get too deep into any fancy styling on this one. Originally, actually, I had started to create an example to make sure I kind of had the general idea of what I wanted to create for this. And I ended up making something that was way overkill, way overstyled, and was going to be too long to explain. So this is going to be pretty ugly as far as a application is considered. It's not going to look too fancy, but I'll leave that to you to kind of explore with CSS and styling it and making it look nice for yourself later on. So next here we have the different links that we're going to have, the home page, the about page, and the home page here. We're saying that only on this exact path are we going to render this main, got a spelling error here, component for the to-do list will be our home page, and then we'll have this about one here. And then down here we're exporting this so that our TSX file can use it, and we're saying that we want to wrap this in the hot module call here, And again, so the way you would do that if you didn't want to do the hot module replacement version would just be to export default app. And then you'd be able to do that. But you can see here we can have multiple default exports, which is why this is complaining. So just so you can kind of see, so you can export it this way as well. You just wouldn't have your hot module replacement stuff as well. So you'd have to refresh your browser page to see changes take effect when you save them and it rebuilds. So that's our app component, and then we'll move in. We'll go ahead and do the CSS. I'm actually going to remove this, and we'll just do our app.css file here. And then we'll add that in, and I'll kind of explain them, but there's not a lot, so we'll do pretty quick. Okay, so this is that nav list tag from back here in our app component file, and you can see we imported the CSS file in here. And what that's saying is we don't want a list style, so we don't want like any bullets or numbering or anything like that on our list one. And you can see there's different kind of list styles you can do. Display is flex. This is going to allow us to determine how we want to orient the element. And in this case, I'm saying I want you to make sure all of the elements within the element that this nav list is in are going in a row rather than a column. So row would be left to right on the page, column's going to be up to down, and then we want to apply a 5-pixel all around margin to every list item within the element that has the nav list class. So here, nav list, this is saying each element, so in this case each list item will be put in a row across the page, and then it will also apply a 5-pixel margin to each one of those list elements. Okay, so now we have that. We're going to make our to-do folder, and we'll actually make our about one, and we'll just kind of knock that one out since it's a little bit quicker. Okay, so we'll add this in, pretty quick component, so I'm going to take a second and then we'll go over it. Okay, so a little bit of difficulty there with a couple things. So the pretty basic component, we've just added a couple things just so that we have some elements on the page. This empty tag here is just to give a fragment, because what would happen is if we tried to do this, it's going to complain that we are trying to return 2 elements instead of 1. And you can certainly do that, but you would have to do an array of JSX elements. And so the way to get around that is you can either do what I had done, or you can make them a div if you want. It's just the div element will be rendered on the page, whereas the fragment is not. It just kind of goes through and figures out how to kind of put these two in place. So either one works, doesn't really matter. That's just kind of what I do in those cases most of the time. So then we're exporting this as our default piece here. And actually one thing I wanted to do as an example, actually I'll probably do it in the app component one as an example, but there's functional components, which is what I've been doing, and then there's class-based components, and there's different ways to use them, and those kind of carry with them some different choices around how you code some of your components. But function components are kind of I would say more the way forward, I think. But I do like class-based components, especially coming from a C# background, which is another strongly typed language. So for me, the class structure is nicer to read, but just some stuff I've been reading is that that it sounds like, just from my interpretation, sounds like that may not have as much good support going forward. with the React language. So, and then one of the things I did while I was zooming through on that fast forward there, as I went through, as I'd noticed this was red, and I didn't explain it, but I had done I think I had like a dash there instead of a period, and so I went and fixed that, and now that part's good to go. So with that said, we'll make our to-do model so that we have something to work with. So we're just going to make an interface. It's just going to have an ID and a label. And then we'll make our, if I can find it, to do list component, or I should do our list item component. So this will represent each item in our to-do list. So I'll make this, and then we'll go over what that looks like. Okay, so we've got our to-do list item. You can see I've imported a CSS file here because we're going to style that a little bit. So we'll add in the CSS in just a moment. And here I'm exporting an interface for some properties that we're saying we want parent components to pass in to our to-do list item component. Anyway, so we have our to-do list item component here, and we're now changing this from the normal where it would just be function component. We're saying this is the type of the properties we want in, and now we're taking in the properties here, and then we're using them. And so we're taking in this label property and rendering it here, and then we're going to display a button so that we can delete each item out of our list. And we're saying we want the to-do list component, or the parent component, to provide the function to delete the actual item. And but we're going to render the button inside the to-do list item. And so that's what that button is here. And we're saying when the button is clicked, we want to call the delete function that the parent component has now passed in. So now we'll go through and we'll add that CSS file really fast. And so there's a few more items in this one compared to the last one, and then I'll explain them when I'm done. Okay, so this first one here is for the whole to-do item component. Again, we're using the display flex and flex direction for all components within inside that class to flex in a row. We're giving the overall component a padding of 5, and then a border, a color to the border, a radius, which will kind of round the border a bit, and then a bottom and the margin to kind of give our row so that each item has a 5-pixel kind of distance before the next one will, before the next to-do item will show up. And then the background color, a max width of 25% of the page at any given time, and then justifying the content. So basically telling, keeping the label. So if we go back to the to-do list item, it's basically saying that the label and the button, or this div here, so everything within here, right, will have a space between justification, which basically pushes them both to the end of the parent element. So in this case, because we have one parent and we only have 2 children, what will happen here is these two will be at opposite ends of the actual to-do list component. Then we're saying every div in that, and we've seen the 2 divs, each one at 5 margin pixel all around. And then on the add button, I've used ID here instead of class to call in the add button, which we'll want to do. Actually, I'm just kidding. I don't even need that. So we'll remove that. Okay. So I think that was something, a remnant from when I was doing my first example before, and I can't remember why I had that there. So we'll keep that out, and then that's it for the to-do list item component. And so I think this will be a simple enough example. We'll actually use this as the to-do list item component as an example for what it looks like to do the class-based one. So we're going to make another file here, and this won't actually be used for anything, but I will just create it just so you can see. So this one, just so you know, this one is completely for visualization. This is not going to actually be used in the running application. So you can completely ignore this one if you don't care about doing a functional based component. Okay, so you might have noticed I cheated there a little bit. I was tired of typing everything out that was kind of the same, so I went and grabbed it from the original function-based component here, and then I made a few changes. So I'll first go over those, and then I'll go over some of the others. But because we're working in a class-based context, then we need the this reference, which is it's a way of referencing everything within the class scope. Which is different when you're dealing with a class-based object. And I don't want to try and get too deep into that and what that can mean and when you don't or don't use it. And then we're still referencing props, so we're saying that the constructor of this class is taking in the to-do list item props. And then we're telling it to pass those properties to the component that we're extending. So this is required for every single component when you're extending it in this way. And then you have this render method, which is how we're returning the eventual element, which is still the same thing. And then we're doing a default export here. So I think this is a little bit nicer of a layout, and I think it's a little bit more verbose in a nice way. I definitely see pros and cons for each one. So it's different. And then in a class-based setup, the way you do state within your class component is a little bit different than you would with a function component. And the function components, you might be able to use React hooks inside a functional component. I don't think you can though, unless there's some weird jiggy way to do it. But I'd say I think I like React hooks a little bit more, which is kind of a new liking. Generally, I think I wouldn't have been a fan of React hooks, but lately I've kind of become a bit more of a fan of them, and those are meant to be used inside functional components, which this is not. So I think that's, and I think there's more investment in the React hooks versus the other way to kind of manage state and stuff. So again, in a future one, I'll go over what the difference in some of that state management looks like, but I just wanted to see kind of what it looks like to have a class-based component versus a functional one. So I think we're running into the last piece here. We'll create our to-do list component. So I'll fill this out, and then we'll go over our last and final piece. Okay, so first thing I'm going to go over before I get into the rest of this is I realized why I actually had that add button CSS earlier. So we'll go ahead and add that back in. I thought I'd had that for a reason, but it seemed like I had just forgotten how I was pulling that in. I think it was 15, no, 10 is what I had that at originally, right? Okay. So this is just saying that the button with the ID add button, and IDs are unique, whereas classes are not, is just saying we're giving that a left margin of 10 pixels. So all right, we'll go over the rest of this. So we've imported everything we need here: React, the to-do interface, the GUID package that I talked about earlier, and then the to-do list item component. And we've made our to-do list functional component here, and we've made a store for our to-dos. And we're just basically, this is just a representation of like a dictionary or like a key value pair, where the key is the ID and then the value is the to-do itself. We've done two states, React hooks for states here. The first one is the actual object that's being changed. The second one is the function that you're using to make the change. And then we're defining that this one is our iToDo store type. We're just initializing it as an empty object or empty dictionary, I guess you would say. And then the second one is a string for our label. And then we have two men when we click the add button, and then delete, which is what we're passing in eventually to the to-do component. And this takes in the ID of the value we want to delete. So in add, we create a new GUID and then just make it a string. Then we create our actual to-do list item with the ID and the label of the current label value, and then we use the spread operator here to create a new object with the existing to-dos, and also adding in the new to-do, and then setting the whole to-dos to the new version of it, and then clearing the label from the input field that we'll have. And then for delete, kind of again here we're using the spread operator to make a copy of the existing ones, and then deleting the one that we want, and then setting the to-dos to the new set of to-dos that has the old one, or the one that we wanted to remove, deleted. Here we're just grabbing all of the keys. So in this case, all the keys are the IDs. So we're just getting an array of to-do IDs in this one, so that we have an easy way to map the different to-do list items. So we have the input here for what you're going to input. We're setting the value to this variable here. And then as it changes, we'll call this set label function, which will set the label input to the value that we're typing in. And then the button for adding, and then when we click that, it will process the onAdd button function. And then finally here we have this disabled flag, so that we don't allow people to just create a bunch of empty to-do list items. So if we haven't typed anything into the input field, the add button will actually be disabled. And then last but not least, we have our list of to-dos here. Map is just a way of saying for each item here, return this other thing. In this case, we're saying as you iterate over each ID, use that ID to then generate the to-do component. And the key is needed here because we have to have a unique key for arrays of items. Otherwise, we get an annoying little warning inside the console. And then ID and label, their properties that we have told that we want here, as well as the delete. And so we're saying, here's your delete function right here. And that's all of that. So the last and final piece, which we'll do, is we'll run this and see what it looks like in the browser and play around with it for a sec. Okay, so I've opened up it opened up the browser and just moved it in the screen here. And you can see nothing fancy here. We've got the home and about page that we talked about before, and we have our input field here for adding it. And as you can see, the add button can't be clicked and it's disabled. And then this is that hash bang I talked about earlier from the routing aspect. So we can come in here and say create a React tutorial video. Add, and there you go. Now we've got a new to-do list item component here, and it's got the text and then the delete button. And you may have not noticed, so as we type this, you can see that add it's kind of hard to probably notice, but this is actually more of a solid black now, and we can click that, but now it's a little grayed out. and then we have this new item here. We can go click on delete and it will delete it, and there you go. There's your simple to-do list. And then for the routing aspect, so we have this about page here just as an example that we had showed earlier. But the nice thing is so as an example, if I used the regular, I think the default router, what is it? Let me double check. I am having a brain fart. Browser router, that was the name. I don't know why I couldn't think of the name for a moment there. So browser router or hash router, and then again, there's other ways you can solve that, as I said before. But if we use the browser router, then we wouldn't be able, the hash bang wouldn't be here, but we can take this URL and we can open another browser page here, and we can go and enter in our about URL, and now you can see we've gone directly to the page. And because what it's done behind the scenes is it's actually still loaded in the root directory, but we just didn't see it happen because the everything after the hash bang is kind of ignored. It's kind of hard to explain without getting too much into it, but and so that's kind of how it handles that. If we did the browser router, it would, and we tried to go directly to the about page, it wouldn't work. But we do have to make sure to include the hash bang for that to work. So if we tried to do the about page directly like that without the hash, we would get this cannot get about because the React app and the router hasn't loaded yet when we hit the page directly like that. So again, I'll probably do a future video where we go pretty in depth to kind of cover all the options you have to get that direct linking working in cases where you want it or need it and you want people to be able to navigate directly to a page. We'll go over that. But that covers the to-do list app. You can go in and kind of customize this however you want. I know when I was looking up a couple of things, as I said before, I went through a pretty long version of this the first time around, and then when I was trying to do some styling, I was looking at some Office Fabric stuff for trying to make it look all nice, and I did notice that when I was looking that up, Microsoft's Office Fabric tutorials site, which I'll have a link for if you want, and for styling in the description below, it actually has a to-do list application as well. And they kind of have some neat stuff on that where there's like filtering for completed ones, so you don't really delete them, you just complete, well, I guess you could delete them, but you can also complete them. You can filter for ones that are active or ones that are completed. So I think that's a neat stretch goal for something you can do if you want to take it a bit further, but I wanted to try and keep this pretty simple. This is probably still going to be pretty long like most of the tutorials as it is, and if I didn't kind of cut it down from what I originally was doing, it probably would have been the longest video I'd ever had. So hopefully this kind of helped you out, helped you get started in seeing how to create a pretty simple React app from scratch without having to use something that some of you may have already heard or even played around with. It's referred to as what's called Create React App, and it's a command line tool that you can use to be able to create a template for a React application that uses like .NET Core as the backend, and it's neat. Like it does a lot of that kind of scaffolding for you to get it ready, but at the cost of not having a lot of customization. So you don't have the ability to kind of do things a bit more in a unique way. The minute you need to do anything kind of custom, it becomes kind of an issue because that Create React app actually obscures all of the Webpack stuff from you. You don't see a Webpack config, and so it gets a lot more complicated, in my opinion, to try and configure those applications and do what you really want with those. So I try and steer away from the templates too much or steer away from the templates and avoid using them because I just think that it makes it harder to learn and understand what's going on. They're nice for just a quick test out, but I definitely wouldn't use them as like a final version of an application that you wanted to build. So hopefully this helps you see how you can kind of make something or add React to an application from scratch. if you have any questions, let me know in the comments section below. And I think that's it for this one. One thing I wanted to go over is I know I did Webpack as an example for this, and I've said in the past in a previous video that Parcel.js is my favorite module bundler, and that still holds true. So I don't want you to think that I'm not favoring Webpack. It's just that there's a little bit more to do with Webpack, and I understand that it's a lot more popular. So I wanted to make sure that I covered that because it's Webpack, and as I've mentioned before, you need to configure a lot more things with Webpack. I wanted to make sure I covered that in this video because there's a bit more to go through. So Parcel, we'll cover that really quick here. There's not a lot to do other than to come in here, do the same thing we did with adding the JSX part and adding in the React, and just for good measure, we'll do the module resolution to node there. And then you'll come in into your package.json file, and this is going to stay the same because we're just using the HTML file, but you would change this. So this is from the example Parcel.js video that I had done, which I'll have a link for in the top for you to click on. So you would change this just like you did to React to a TSX file and create the rest of what you needed. And then in your HTML file, all you're going to do is TSX, and then you're done. That's all you need to do. There's no extra config for Parcel to be able to use your React stuff. You don't have to add a bunch of different lines or any special hot loaders or anything like that, which is, again, that's one of the reasons why I love Parcel so much, is it makes that process pretty simple. I think the last thing that I think I said I would cover is we'll stop this really fast, and we'll do our watch here instead of just starting the application, so that we can get our output in our dist folder here. And so you'll see here that everything is minified. Or is it? Oh, yeah, everything is minified. Yeah, so this is, and you'll even see here, it actually pulls in the min aspect here. And that's actually because I realize now that we left off so we'll stop the watch here. I left off because we removed the development aspect, I needed to add it to the watch script as well. So we'll do mode development again, and just for giggles, we'll add the hot flag there as well, and then we'll do our npm run watch. Run it again, and now we should see, there we go. So now this is unminified, so we can see all the function names and different variables that are created. They have the full name there. Whereas before, a lot of it was obscured and obviously much harder to read and see what was going on, and that's intended to make it more difficult for people to be able to read and figure out your code in production systems. So optional, but I just wanted to kind of explain what that was, and I think that's it. Hopefully this video has helped you see how quick and easy it can be to set up a React application, and how powerful React can be with its use of the virtual DOM. In some previous videos, I'd gotten some feedback that the font size I was using in VS Code was a little small. I had bumped it up in the last couple videos, but I still got some feedback that the font size was a little too small, so I've again bumped it up in this video. If the font size is a little bit bigger or too big at this point, please let me know in the comment section below. If it's still not big enough, let me know and I'll try and bump it up again. So hopefully this time it's worked out. In a future video, I'll probably go over some more advanced concepts of React, including the addition of a library called Redux, which is a state management application that's usually paired pretty well with React. There's been some changes as far as some what's referred to as the context API for React that's made Redux a little bit less needed in certain kinds of applications, but nonetheless, Redux is really powerful and really great, but it's a pretty hefty topic in and of itself, so I'm definitely going to save that for a future video. That's it for me. I'm going to see you guys in the next one.